So the ATF's frames and receiver rule was struck down nationwide as invalid and beyond the ATF's authority. But since then, there's been a lot of major updates that have now come out, so we need to talk about it. But real quick before we jump into this video, if you think the ATF needs to be abolished, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. Also want to give a shout out to one of the main supporters of this channel, which is USCCA. Through your membership, you get training, education, and self-defense liability protection. So if you carry a firearm, I highly recommend you take a look into USCCA, and I will leave a link to them down below if you're interested. As I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we will be discussing the ATF's rule on frames and receivers, which was recently struck down by a federal court as entirely invalid. The case we will be talking about in this video is called Vanderstock v. Garland. This is a lawsuit decided by a Texas federal district court judge, Judge Reed O'Connor, and the plaintiffs in this case, FPC, were seeking a motion for summary judgment against the ATF and their new rule on frames and receivers that went into effect last August. And Judge Reed O'Connor recently ruled that the frames and receivers rule is in fact invalid and goes beyond the ATF's authority. Therefore, he granted the plaintiffs their motion for summary judgment and vacated the frames and receivers rule in its entirety nationwide. That was a huge win because the ATF's frames and receivers rule was struck down nationwide, but the ATF is not willing yet to take that loss. The ATF has recently received a temporary administrative stay from the court here so that they can request a stay from the Fifth Circuit and also seek an appeal. The administrative stay was issued for 7 days, but the plaintiffs in this case have fired back seeking their own type of relief. Defense Distributed, one of the plaintiffs, along with SAF and then now also JSD Supply, have filed for emergency motions for injunctions pending the appeal. This means that Defense Distributed, SAF, and also JSD Supply want the court here, Judge O'Connor, to issue an emergency injunction, and essentially here it's a clarification on an injunction, which would ultimately halt the rule from being put back into effect by the ATF while the Fifth Circuit appeal is taking place. Now, you may recall that in this case, the plaintiffs requested a preliminary injunction from the court to enjoin, i.e. halt the enforcement of the ATF's new rule, while this case is making its way through the process and is making it through the lower court. On review, Federal Judge Reed O'Connor originally granted a limited preliminary injunction against the ATF. Looking at the ATF's final rule on frames and receivers, he found that it is facially invalid under the plain text of the statute and that Congress did not grant the ATF authority to regulate these types of items. So he granted a limited preliminary injunction in favor of one of the plaintiffs, which was Tactical Machining. He later expanded the injunction to protect the customers of Tactical Machining and also Tactical Machining itself, and then other companies like 80% Arms, Defense Distributed, JSD Supply, SAF, and others jumped into the lawsuit and got a similar type of relief. After the ATF lost that battle, they decided to appeal the granting of that injunction up to the Fifth Circuit. And currently there is an interlocutory appeal up before the Fifth Circuit on the issuance of that injunction by Judge O'Connor. But while that issue was making its way through the process, the plaintiffs, in this case FPC and others, continued in the lower court and were seeking a motion for summary judgment to ultimately resolve this case. And that's exactly what happened recently. Judge O'Connor issued his decision on the motion for summary judgment, which found in favor of the plaintiffs and vacated the ATF's final rule on frames and receivers. In his decision, Judge O'Connor stated that this case presents the question of whether the federal government may lawfully regulate partially manufactured firearms components, related firearms products, and other tools and materials in keeping with the Gun Control Act of 1968. Because the court concludes that the government cannot regulate those items without violating federal law, the court holds that the government's recently enacted final rule definition of frame or receiver and identification of firearms is unlawful agency action taken in excess of the ATF statutory jurisdiction. On this basis, the court vacates the final rule. So the main thrust of his decision on that motion for summary judgment is that the ATF acted beyond their authority under the GCA, and therefore the rule is entirely invalid. Now, in response to that decision of vacating the final rule, the ATF gave notice that they would file an appeal up to the Fifth Circuit. Then they requested a stay of the judgment from the district court. Essentially, the ATF wanted Judge O'Connor to stay his own judgment. The ATF wanted that stay to remain in effect during the entire Fifth Circuit appeal. Judge O'Connor answered that request by denying the ATF's request for an emergency stay for the entire appeal, but he did grant them a 7-day administrative stay. That administrative stay means that the ATF now has 7 days to go to the Fifth Circuit and also seek a stay from the Fifth Circuit. So that administrative stay is currently in place and will remain in place for the next week. That means technically that the frames and receivers, I guess, could be enforceable, but that is one of the big questions. Is the 7-day administrative stay essentially allowing the ATF to still enforce the rule, or are some of the prior preliminary injunctions still in place and simply just kick back in? That is the question that is currently being placed by the other plaintiffs in this case, and they posed that question to Judge O'Connor by also submitting emergency motions for preliminary injunctions. Plaintiffs Defense Distributed, along with JSD Supply and SAF, are seeking an emergency motion for an injunction pending appeal. What this means is that Defense Distributed, along with some of the other plaintiffs, want clarification from the court that the prior injunctions that were issued and put in place by Judge O'Connor before this final ruling, whether or not those still remain in effect during the whole Fifth Circuit appeal. That would mean that even now the prior injunctions would remain in effect, and if the Fifth Circuit decides to stay his summary judgment decision, the emergency injunction and the prior injunctions would still prevent the ATF from enforcing the final rule. Now, I know there's some procedural stuff that's going on here, and maybe you guys are getting a little bit confused, but just think of this as a reverse Uno card. The ATF may think that they can stay the final decision of Judge O'Connor, and therefore they could enforce the final rule, but the plaintiffs here are saying, well, don't forget about the preliminary injunction that this court issued prior. That would still be in effect. Yes, you're appealing that granting of the preliminary injunction, and you're also going to appeal the granting of the final decision, but you would have to deal with that at the Fifth Circuit level. But the plaintiffs with this motion are saying, don't forget about the preliminary injunction that we were granted prior to the final ruling. The motion by the plaintiff states, Defense Distributed files this emergency motion for an injunction pending appeal. The request is for an injunction paralleling the preliminary injunction this court issued as of March 8th, 2023. Technically, an order staying the court's final judgment, administratively or otherwise, should be understood to resurrect the March 8th preliminary injunction order automatically, without the need for any further party or court action. But the agencies oppose that view. They posit that an order staying the court's final judgment would somehow halt the final judgment's vacature of the final rule, but not reactivate the March 8th preliminary injunction. So to avoid any doubt about the procedural issue, Defense Distributed files this motion to guarantee square presentation of their request for an injunction pending appeal that mirrors the prior preliminary injunction. So this is an important argument that's being made by the plaintiffs here in this case, and they are arguing that there is no way that they can be put in a worse situation than they were prior to the granting of the summary judgment. Instead, at the very least, if the final decision is stayed by the Fifth Circuit, then the prior injunctions should kick back in and protect them during the appeal. The prior preliminary injunction protection should not magically just disappear and put the ATF in a better position than they were before the final decision on the summary judgment. So what this means is that the plaintiffs, Defense Distributed, JSD Supply, SAF, and some of the other plaintiffs want the prior preliminary injunction to kick back in even if the Fifth Circuit grants a stay of Judge O'Connor's prior decision. This would mean that there would still be some sort of protections for those companies, including JSD Supply, Defense Distributed, Tactical Machining potentially, all these other companies who prior got protections from the preliminary injunction. Essentially here, they're arguing that there is no way that they should be put in a worse position. Instead, the preliminary injunctions should simply just kick back in while this appeal is taking place before the Fifth Circuit. So this is going to be an important battle in a very dynamic situation going forward. So make sure you stay tuned, subscribe to the channel, and make sure you have the notification bell on, and also you set it to all notifications. And of course, if you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is to like, comment, and subscribe. All those things help to fuel the algorithm, and it signals to YouTube that you guys see value in these videos and in this type of 2A news. As always, I want to thank everybody who likes, comments, subscribes, who hits the notification bell, who shares these videos. You guys are directly impacting these videos, impacting this channel, and helping me to reach and educate more people than I could ever do on my own. So as always, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And don't forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.